Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at Seward Park Audubon Center for our recurring community science program, Science, Nature, and a. And today is a very exciting day because we're going to be talking about an endemic plant, a tree, the Garry oak, or Oregon white oak, as it's also known, and its significance in terms of ecological significance in terms of human history, because we believe many of our big Garry oaks are, in a sense, living Stonehenges, meaning that they are here because of cultures past that have kept them going for thousands of years. But I will let the experts talk more about that and what we can do to ensure the Garry oak survival into the future, because there are several threats that are facing it. So after today's indoor part of the presentation, there will be a tour of the local Garry oaks we have here. So you're welcome to join our team as they take you on that journey, and you can look at the living Stonehenges. And I would like to introduce our panel of experts for today. We have David Parasso, who's a forest steward down at our nearby adjacent park, Martha Washington Park, working to conserve Garry oaks and native plants there. And he's helped me a great deal the past few years here at Seward Park with our oaks. We have Dr. Timothy Bill from the University of Washington, and representing the Muckleshoot group tribal people with as the historian, we have Warren King George. Sorry about that. So without further ado or any further mistakes, allow me to bring our panel up today and let's learn about our Garry oaks. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, Ed, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Seward Park Audubon Society here for hosting us today. It's great to see so many people out here. I really appreciate the interest in this topic. I also want to just acknowledge Paul Talbert and the Friends of Seward Park and the work Friends of Seward Park is doing and has done for a long time in stewarding Seward Park's ecosystems here, Seward Park's forests, and the research they've done on the Garry oak ecosystems here in South Seattle. I'll be drawing on much of that research that Paul Talbert and others from the Friends of Seward Park have done over the years. And I also just want to recognize Seattle Parks and Rec. We have several folks here from Seattle Parks and the great work that they do managing all of our amazing parks here in Seattle. You want me to move this over? Okay, I guess I'm off the camera. Okay. I'll do that. It's on mute. Okay, so the topic for today is planning for the future of Seward Park's Garry oaks, and oak ecosystem here along the shoreline of the South Shore of Seward Park. And before I go any further, though, I do want to offer this land acknowledgement in the tradition of the Coast Salish people, and I'll just read it. So we meet today in the homelands of the people collectively known as Pachuaps, or the people of the lake, who have stewarded the lands and waters around Squaps, also known as the Bailey Peninsula and Seward Park since time immemorial. And we owe a debt of gratitude to them, and we are here today to discuss how to carry their legacy forward. And as Ed alluded to, these oak ecosystems really are monuments to the original people of this land, the people who cared for this land, and really established these oak woodlands here within what was otherwise a larger coniferous forest biome. So I'll just give a brief outline of how this is going to work. I'll begin by talking about the natural history of our local oak woodlands here around the shoreline of Seward Park and down to Brighton Beach. Then I'll hand it off to Warren, who's going to talk about the cultural importance of oak woodlands for the Coast Salish people. And then finally, David will finish off talking about the health and management options for Seward Park's oak and oaks and oak woodland. And we're gonna end with audience questions and open discussion, and we really do want your feedback, your ideas. You all are the community, because we should be planning as a community what to do and how to manage Seward Park's ecosystems going forward. Okay, so that's the plan. I'm gonna start here just by making sure everyone's on the same page with what Garry Oaks are, and I've been having some interesting discussions with folks here before the talk started. I actually brought in a number of samples of Garry Oak, which maybe I'll just pass around for those of you in the room. You can sort of pass these around, take a look at Garry Oak leaves and buds yourself. Garry Oak is known as Quercus garryana in the language of science. It's also known as Casades in the northern Lushootseed language, and possibly in southern too, is right? Yep. Okay. Also known as Oregon white oak, and I had some folks asking me, is Oregon white oak the same as Garry Oak? It is the same species. Okay, so this is what we're talking about, and I'll refer to it as Garry Oak for simplicity for the rest of the talk, but in Quercus garryana, Casades, or Oregon white oak, all synonymous with Garry Oak. So important to know, this is Washington's only native oak. And we have a lot of oak species planted around Seattle here, but Garry Oak is the only native oak to Washington State. Okay. And so there's a number of oaks that we might confuse with Garry Oak, one of them being Quercus robur, which is a European oak planted around the city. I'll just point out some differences here between Quercus robur and Quercus garryana, the Garry Oak. Garry Oak's leaves have rounded lobes. Quercus robur does as well, but you'll notice the lobes on Garry Oak are highly variable. So look at the variation in leaf shape on those leaves that I'm passing around. Okay, highly variable, but rounded for the most part. The petioles, or the leaf stalks of Garry Oak, are elongated, and this is actually a fairly big difference between Quercus garryana and Quercus robur. The elongated petiole. The leaf of Garry Oak tapers cleanly to the petiole, unlike Quercus robur, which actually has a little notch at the base of the leaf where it attaches to the petiole. Pointed and hairy buds, another characteristic of Quercus garryana. You can check that out on the samples I'm passing around. The acorns of Quercus garryana have no stem, so they appear to attach directly to the twig with a very minimal stem. Leaves dark green with a slight fuzziness on the underside. And this is something I think which is sort of the aesthetic appeal of Garry Oak, and makes it different from Quercus robur as well. These very rounded crowns or canopies, and you can see that in the central image here is this very rounded crown shape with wide spreading branches spreading out to 50 feet wide. It's a really aesthetically pleasing tree. Okay, and again, it's our only native oak here in Washington. So Garry Oak ranges from California all the way up into southern British Columbia, pretty wide range here on the West Coast. But here in Western Washington, which is the map on the right side, Garry Oak ecosystems are shown in orange here, and you can see that Garry Oak is quite patchily distributed in Western Washington. And it's actually called it's labeled here on this map as the Douglas fir Oregon white oak zone. I'll come back to that, but so this is Western Washington's most endangered ecosystem within this context of mostly coniferous forest, and I'll add a lot of development here along the I-5 corridor in Western Washington. Less than 3% of the original oak savannas remain. Okay, so it's a highly endangered and important ecosystem. Again, threats to this ecosystem are development, agriculture, invasive species, and perhaps most importantly, fire suppression. And fire is and was the tool that was used to maintain these openings in what otherwise would be a Douglas fir forest. And that's really important. If you don't manage these ecosystems, they convert or revert to Douglas fir. And so the management is really, really important. And this gets me to the fact that oak woodlands are cultural ecosystems. Their existence, especially here in Western Washington, is due to the presence of people and people managing these ecosystems for hundreds and in many cases thousands of years. Okay. Historically, indigenous people burned these ecosystems every 5 to 30 years, depending on the location. Okay. And this was important. Controlled burning is key. Garry oak is shade intolerant, and you have to burn away or suppress the Douglas fir, which is the main competitor on these oak savannas or oak woodlands. And burning also facilitates characteristic understory species, and that's really, really important as well. There are many, many species associated with oak which don't grow well under other kinds of canopies. And oak ecosystems harbor unique and culturally important biodiversity. So we know that indigenous people were not burning just for oaks, but also for the species associated with oaks. And Warren is going to talk more about this, but I'll just mention one of these species, which many of you are familiar with, the common camas, Masia quamash, shown here on the left. A beautiful flower, but also a key food species and a food staple in the diets of indigenous peoples, both past and present. So I mentioned many other species. Here's a list of 30 species that David has been working with in some of his work at Martha Washington Park, restoring oak savannas, or sorry, oak woodlands, not technically savannas, but more woodland habitat along the shoreline just south of Seward Park. And one of the neat things about these flowering plants that grow under oaks is the staggering of the bloom times across almost the entire year from February to October. So you can imagine that not only are these oak understories aesthetically pleasing for us, but also they play an important role for species of insects and birds that may be dependent on nectar or pollen. Okay, so really beautiful staggering of bloom times across the entire year, across all of these 30 species associated with oak woodlands. So we also have greater than 800 species of insects that are known to associate with Garry oak woodlands. Here's a smattering of those species. These are photographs all taken in the Garry oak woodland restoration project that David has been working on down at Martha Washington Park. More than, or at least 20 species of birds are known to associate or prefer to associate with Garry oak and the structures that Garry oak provide. This is a western bluebird up on San Juan Island. Western bluebirds are quite uncommon west of the Cascades and certainly uncommon in the San Juans, but becoming more common as the San Juan Preservation Trust has been working to preserve Garry oak ecosystems up there in the San Juans. So here in South Seattle, we have a lot of evidence of the historical oak woodland that existed along the shoreline here. We have 32 historic oaks in and around Seward Park. These are oaks that are 100 to sometimes over 200 years old. These are David's estimates based on tree rings that he's looked at on some of the older oaks that have fallen over the years. 1850s surveys of this area note deadenings, which are presumably burned areas within the forest, and oaks along the hillside and lakeshore south from the Bailey Peninsula to Brighton Beach. We also have what we call name memory, place names that relate to the historic oak woodlands that were here. Clark's Prairie, for example, is a named place on the south shore of Seward Park. Oakhurst Street and other streets named after oaks up here, just up here in the neighborhood on Graham Hill, are an ode to these historic oak woodlands here in Seattle. We have a known historic longhouse site down at Brighton Beach, and these would have been the people, the Hachuaps, who would have likely helped to establish these oak woodlands and maintain these oak woodlands. Okay, so strong evidence of the historical oak woodland here in South Seattle. David has actually gone out and mapped 32 historic oaks in South Seattle, and we've looked elsewhere, but you can see how the Garry oaks really concentrate here in this area around South Seattle, in particular the south shore of Seward Park, around Martha Washington Park, and as far west as just west of Rainier Avenue. And I'll show you a photo of this tree labeled X1 on this map. It's a giant old Garry oak in the neighborhood just west of Rainier Avenue, going in someone's private backyard. And so we have a number of amazing examples like this, which we believe are the evidence of this oak woodland, which extended quite a ways from the shoreline between, again, Seward Park and all the way down to Brighton Beach. So the oaks of Squaps, or Seward Park, as it's known today, we have a few that are greater than 200 years old. We have a lot that are around 100 years old. We believe these trees are the descendants of trees established by the Hachuaps, and descendants of trees that were felled by settlers when they took over this area. The origin of these trees is due to both seed, probably, and coppice. Coppicing is where you have sprouts sprouting out of tree stumps and root systems that have been cut. This image here, I believe, is a likely example of two quite mature oaks that are of coppice origin sprouting out of likely a stump that was perhaps felled by settlers in this area. And we believe that the Hachuaps likely conducted skillful burns of this area roughly every 5 years to maintain oak madrone woodland. And I'll just add that unlike a lot of the areas I showed in orange on that distribution map in Western Washington, Seward Park is a little bit wetter than those areas. Some of the areas in orange were in rain shadow habitats. Rain shadow behind the Olympic Mountains, for example, the San Juan Islands are a rain shadow habitat, much drier, less rainfall. Whidbey Island, again, much drier, less rainfall than here. And in South Puget Sound, we have oak growing on these glacial outwash plains, which are very gravelly soil. So here in Seward Park, more rain and much wetter soil. We have a lot of clay here along the lake shore. So I would say that, you know, it took skill to maintain the oak savanna here, or the oak woodland, sorry. And it took probably fairly frequent burning to keep this habitat open and to suppress the Douglas fir, which otherwise would come back. And I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to pass it off to Warren now, who's going to talk more about the cultural significance of these oak woodlands to the Coast Salish people. So thank you, Warren. Come on up. Yeah. So I'll move out of the way. Yeah.
Sgil dys iaiet si hyd go eich vat dys iaius. Good day. My name is Warren P. George. I'm an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe through my late father's bloodline. I'm also a descendant from the Upper Skagit tribe through my late mother's bloodline. So together with these two bloodlines, I believe I have the Puget Sound region covered. So I'm employed with the tribe as a historian, but one of my favorite topics is ethnobotany. So this topic falls within my wheelhouse. It's more of a passion, than a job for me. I love this type of work. And I'm really truly blessed to be able to have some wonderful and generous traditional teachers who were willing to share some of the secrets and share some of the properties and cultural values of some of these plants that we share this place with. First of all, I want to thank the Audubon Society for the invitation, David, for putting together some of the details for this, and the invitation as well to participate. I've got a short presentation to help convey a little bit about the cultural importance, the traditional significance of some of the plants, not only the Garry oak, but some of the plants that are associated with Garry oak. And so I brought some pictures to help you understand a little bit about why it is that the tribal people, why we embrace this tree, why we embrace the plants that are associated with this tree. And so hopefully we can walk away understanding just a little bit more about who we are as Untitled Chapter, and a little bit more about some of our values. Okay? Thank you. Duwamish. Our language. So Bakwa is a general term for prairie. And Ali is reference being that it's a place, the prairie place. And that's what I call this area where we're going to visit today in our language. Wabali. So post-treaty, that's what I call our village of Muckleshoot today. It's a post-treaty village, meaning that post-treaty, our ancestors were asked to relocate and convene on this place in what was then called Slaughter, or called Auburn, Washington now. So that's our home today, post-treaty village of Muckleshoot, which was a prairie. And before it was what's called a reservation, or a modern day village, or a post-treaty village, what I refer to as a post-treaty village, Muckleshoot. Okay, so this tree stands on a very small piece of land that my family, the King George family, owns, and it is a gathering place for elk. And so this is very close to our administration building called the Philip Starr Building. Philip Starr Building being named after the one of the owners, the original owners of that land post-treaty. So our offices now are just across the street, literally from this beautiful, magnificent tree that you see here. Now this photo was taken about a week ago. Our elk, Squawwichit in our language, gather underneath this tree almost all year round now, because there's a pasture that's now surrounded by this tree. There's actually several trees, but this is the one that they prefer to gather under, or to huddle, or to congregate around. And virtually all the seeds are gone from about 10 feet up. They're all they're out trying to gather, and there's nothing left. So this is a good example of what our ancestors were doing during their time, is they were managing these trees, not only to provide shade and to provide wood for utensils or bows and arrows, but to attract some of those ungulates that really benefit from this tree, right? There's lots of benefits, right? So it provides oxygen, provides shade, holds the soil together, right? And you've heard Dr. Billow reference reference to all the birds that benefit from this beautiful tree. Well, the ungulates also are very drawn to it. And so where you find ungulates in historic times, you're gonna find some of the native people are also gonna follow that. It's part of the food chain. It's part of how nature works. So, you know, it's much easier to draw the animal to you than it is for you to go out and find the animal. They're way more craftier than we are. Way more, they're way stronger and way faster than us humans, us bipeds. So one simple way, one simple solution is to provide an opportunity closer to home to gather, to hunt, to feed your family, to feed your people. And this is one way. I'm actually thinking about making a t-shirt out of this picture. It's really nice, isn't it? Yeah. So along with these beautiful trees, also you can find what we call quaqual in our language. In the southern Lushootseed it's called quaqual, which is the general term for a prairie. So there was a network of these prairies throughout Puget Sound, not just it wasn't that long ago. People used to associate Camas with the east side, with our relatives on Colville and Yakima and Omak and Wenatchee. But after our elders were real, I guess, tenacious about, you got to remember that, our ancestors were savvy and they knew what, knew where to grow and what to grow and what was good and what wasn't good. So what you see here in this photograph are remnants of the old Camas, which is about a quarter-mile away from the tree that you saw. This is what's left of the old Camas prairie that was there on Buffalo Shoes. This is an example of what the Camas, what it looks like early in spring. These were actually salvaged from a place in Covington on a church that was doing some, I guess it was a utility vault project. And they had no idea that the Camas were growing on their property. And so after the project was complete, my wife and I went in and just collected these off the surface near this project. Of course, we approached the pastor and asked permission, and he had no idea what this plant was, had no idea about its value, and granted us permission to go and gather as much as we could. That was already disturbed by all the plants that were really disturbed. So we pulled those up and we gathered them and salvaged them and transplanted them back home and in Makoshi. There are lots of plants that benefit from fire. Fire has been mentioned as a management tool. And so our elders were real keen on the idea and utilized it because it was simple and it made a lot of sense. The thing is, not everybody possesses the skills to manage fire the proper way. And so there were a handful of people selected in families that were given or were appointed the responsibility of managing the family plots. In those days, it wasn't a boundary, or it wasn't a map. It was actually a pile of stones that usually identified family plots. And these plots were routinely burned every 1 year for blackcaps, every 3 years for blackberries, every 5 years for camas. And you heard the reference that every 7, 10 years, 20 years for oak trees. Right? So there were lots of benefits to fire when done properly and when managed, when and respected and honored and done the right way. It can be beneficial to everybody and everything within life's circle, within life's calendar. So you don't do it in the summertime, you don't do it, you don't do it in the wintertime. You usually burn towards the end of fall. And it's real damp in the morning, where things are not quite as brittle and dry as they are during July and August. Right, so you want to make sure that your fuel is not going to run away from you. So these little tricks about managing and utilizing fire as a management tool to benefit, to help Mother Nature, to work with Mother Nature. So these are plants that exist in my wife's garden. These are the wild strawberries. They come from the Cedar River watershed, where we know that there's no chemicals, there's no spray. It's all real restricted and real highly managed. So the wild strawberry is something that we still use and still enjoy today. It's in our backyard now, as well as the onion, the hooker's onion. Same thing. These onions come from my uncle, the late Bruce Miller. He gathered them from Chehalis, which is another beautiful oak forest, oak tree savanna. Really generous with the oak trees there. So when we talk about management, when we talk about the benefits, we always need to consider, there's lots and lots of things that benefit from proper management. And I just want to reach out and extend to some of the people who have influence in this room and who are joining us virtually. Those of you who have the network to policymakers and to city and park officials and some of the higher ups, that I know that there are some policies that prevent trees from growing so high, or there's policies that prevent trees that are too broad, or the root systems are too delicate. I just want to encourage you, the people who have influence, or the people who have this access to and their network to people who get to make choices and make policies and make rules and laws, that we as human people, we as human beings, there are certain things that we require to be a part of Mother Nature's larger picture, Mother Nature's puzzle, as some would say, life's little network. And it's important that we have all of those features, we have all of those pieces of the puzzle that make life work. It's important to us as human beings, it's important to us as Native people. Because we as Native people, one of the things that we really like, even though we can't harvest a lot of the berries or a lot of the material that we see along the corridors of I-5 and I-90 and 405 and Highway 18, it's nice to see the material. Our elders say, well, I know that we can't use it, but it sure is nice to see the mock orange along the Highway 167. And that's new, and that's because of conversations that had taken place with some of those people who get to make decisions about the replanting of the native species, about not using invasive species in their restoration projects, utilizing what's here. Mother Nature had it right at first. We're the ones that got it wrong as human beings. And we got to follow that template that she laid down years and years ago, long before we were here. Long before. So, thank you for listening to that spiel about it's actually targeting some of the policymakers and some of our higher ups there in the city government and county governments that we have to work with. But I certainly want to thank you once again for sharing your Sunday afternoon, your NFL Sunday afternoon. I'm grateful, thankful for that. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments that you have after our presentation today. I'm gonna stick around. I wanna go for the walk too. Okay, so, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention and your kindness. Thank you.
Do I have to point? Nope, it's not advanced. I think it's getting my presentation, this one will be right.
Just keep going forward, it's,
Okay, well, let's see, it's not doing anything, yeah. Let's try putting on my glasses, so I can see what I'm doing. Oh my God, there's people out there. I don't think they wanted up the computers. Okay.
you push the arrow.
Oh, the arrow, that's what it is. There we go, okay. That's you. So, I don't think I have anything as polished as these two gentlemen just did, but I'm gonna talk about what I've seen at Seward Park. There's a lot of really good things about the oaks here. There's a few problems that we can talk about. And some ideas of what we can do, and some examples of what has been done. But before I start, I want to stress that when I mention problems, I don't mean that as a criticism of the Parks Department. Most of these problems at Seward are the result of things that were done like many decades ago in practices. And my experience with the Parks Department is that they go the extra mile to do what they can. And really the reason our parks are as good as they are is not only because of parks, it is because of parks, but I need to do louder. Louder? Yeah. Can the audience hear me?
The microphone for the online people is over here.
The microphone for online people.
Yeah, if you speak louder.
I will do my best. All right, and my experience has been that parks goes the extra effort to help the people who are volunteering at parks. And that's what the parks volunteers do. But anyway, let's start. Press that on. I think we can do that. So I'm going to go through. Sorry, I'm getting used to the system here. You know, what we have in the park and the actions we can take and the resources that are available to us. There we go. We're going to look at some of the interesting trees at Seward Park. This is a tree that Tim already showed you in one picture, but it is definitely the best oak in the park. And it's really perfectly well placed. Its roots and canopy can grow to their full potential. One of the things about a Garry oak and many other trees that we don't realize is that the root system is usually 3 times as big as the canopy of the tree. Whoa. Okay, and that's typical of plants. Okay? When you plant that carrot by itself in the ground, and you get the carrot that's about this long, you don't realize it's got a root system that's a couple feet longer, and that some of the roots go out to the side. You don't see that at all. Anybody who's studied gardening will figure this out. Anybody who's done forestry really knows that each tree has a root system that's, this root system is out 2 years someplace, maybe even 3. Okay. So this tree's in a good spot for that. So we could make this, for example, a stopping point on our tour. And I'm going to give an example of what another site is doing with tours as we go through this talk. We could also make it an understory garden, which I understand was actually tried here. And I will talk a little bit about how you make understory gardens be successful in places like that. The other thing we want to consider is that the tree might need some special pruning to keep branches from falling. Garry oaks have a habit of dropping their branches. And we could, with a, ordinarily in a forest, you would let the branches drop. I mean, in a thick forest, you don't go around and prune every tree, right? But this is a showcase tree. This is a guardian tree. This is watching over the area. So it's a tree that we might want to put some extra effort into. And I know that that's hard for our Parks Department to do because they're understaffed, completely understaffed. The Forestry Department, I think, has 8 people in it. Is that?
There's more, but
Not much more.
yeah.
Okay, how many trees do they have? 500,000, I think? Yeah. So they can't go around and prune every tree. All right? The next slide is an interesting area. And actually, it was just what happened here was just mentioned to me. But this is just above. There's 4 Garry oaks in here, only a couple of conifers. And the interesting thing is that this area underneath this tree used to be snowberry and was recently mowed. And I know there's some issues about how that happened and why that was done that Parks is trying to figure out. But one of the things you need to do under the Garry oaks, if you can't burn, is mow. And then you can grow things like camas and other fruit plants and things like that underneath this area. We have a spot at Martha Washington Park where we cut down the snowberry every year. We don't even remove it. We just cut it down. And the camas is growing great in there. And it's underneath the oak tree. So another thing is that many of our recently planted Garry oaks were planted with wide spacing. I think you can see, it's hard for me to see this being up close. But I think there's one over there, one here, and one over here. And as these trees don't cover the area right now, but they will over time. And some of these spots are going to be wonderful places to do the kind of understory that Warren was talking about. And since I've mentioned understory gardens a few times, I'm going to switch right now and talk about Martha Washington Park, which has a stand, originally a stand of 9 historic oaks. One of them fell last year. But I want to explain a little bit about what goes on in an understory garden. So there's words like prairie and meadow, oak woodland, open oak woodland, understory garden. There's some fuzziness about the meaning of those things. A prairie is generally considered to be a grassy place with no trees, and an oak woodland is considered to be a place with a lot of trees. And there's kind of a continuum between those two ends. But there's a lot of species. The species overlap for the understory is very strong. Under a Garry oak, you can grow almost everything that you can grow on a full sun gravel outwash prairie. Not everything, but most everything. And there's a few plants that you can grow there that you can't grow in the gravel outwash prairie because it's too dry. But Garry oaks have the property of leafing out very late in the year. As a result, the understory plants can grow all the way into May with almost full sun. And then they shade that area during the summer, so it remains cool and humid. And so the plants bloom for longer periods of time and certain plants can survive that it can't survive in the area. I was going to read this thing so I wouldn't get lost, but let's keep forgetting to do that. Anyway, we created understory gardens under the Garry oaks of Washington Park. And I've seen a lot of understory gardens fail. And what happens is they gradually succeed to shrubs and then to trees. And it's no longer a prairie type garden. Right? Well, traditional knowledge is you burn it every now and then, right? And that's pretty obvious. I mean, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they used to burn the hills every year until the mid-1960s. And we would go out every summer and collect butterflies, and we grew like 20 or 30 species. Well, they stopped burning in the 1960s, and what do we get? Great big forest fires at this point. And you'd be lucky if you find a cabbage walk out there. So the idea of burning regularly is something I knew as a teenager, right? And it's backed up by traditions all over the world. And it has been honed to a fine skill set here in the Pacific Northwest by the indigenous people here. But guess what? If we were to set fire to the park at Martha Washington Park, let's just say we'd be in trouble. So what did we do? We did the next best thing. We cut it every year. Okay? And it works. It's not quite the same. We don't recycle the nutrients the same. We also have some other advantages, which is since we're cutting it by hand, since we're not old enough to use lawnmowers, we can't use power tools basically for insurance reasons. But we cut it by hand. We can say, oh, this area gets cut every year. This area gets cut every 2 years. This area gets cut every 5 years. And that allows us to put multiple ecotypes in a small area. Whereas if we were burning, we would have to have a big area for the 5-year one and a big area, we just don't have enough space. So by cutting it by hand, even though it's a lot of work, it really gives us a lot of flexibility. And what did we get? Well, here's the canvas patch that we created. This has been going for 9 years, sustained for 9 years. Here's a few of the flowering plants underneath, and Tim already showed you that we get blooms from mid-February, and actually are still blooming at Mark Washington Park. The Hall's aster is still blooming, and so is the yarrow. And of course, there are many species that we have growing there that are fruit plants. They're just some of the bulbs that we have growing there. One of the things I want to say about this plant here, this is called rice root or chocolate lily or checker lily, Fritillaria finis. And it's every time I tell somebody we have it, it was a Native American lily, I have some. You know, I mean, it's really a treasure plant. It's a wonderful edible plant. And it's died out in many of our prairies. And the question is why? And I'll talk a little bit about why later. But we have here, it's hard for me to see this, so I guess I have to move it here. We've got great camas down at the bottom. You can see how that it's larger than the small camas. There are two different types of camas, and I'm guessing that this is the ukao over here, which is a corn, which is edible raw. So these plants, plus the onions, plus actually some of the seeds of the clarkias are edible plants that we grow here. And we've learned a lot about ground nesting bees. One of the things we've learned, and this comes again from burning, the concept of burning is, you can't mulch everything. If you mulch everything, you're going to choke off the bees. And later on, I'll talk about these Garry best management practices documents that have been created. They all talk about leaving at least 30% of the ground unmulched for the bees. And we stumbled into that and learned about what we were doing and how well it worked. All right, let's look at some of the problems at Seward. The biggest problem at Seward is conifer encroachment. If you look over here at the left, you'll see an arrow pointing to the Garry oak tree. And it's surrounded by conifers, absolutely surrounded. This is probably the worst one, but it's the only one that we can take a picture of the Garry oak because of the road, and so you can stand back far enough from it to see what's going on. Eventually, the conifers will get up to 150 feet or whatever and just completely shade the oak out and kill it. A lot of the historic oaks at Seward Park are going to have that happen to them. And I have to admit that that's a difficult problem because we don't want to just go willy-nilly cut down a conifer forest either. So we have to have an evaluation of these oaks, figure out which ones of them we want to save, and how we're going to do it. And again, this is not something caused by the current Parks Department. This has been policy in Seattle for hundreds of years. And we're having to go back and look at the problems that that policy created. Another problem that we have is planted tree spacings. Those are Garry oak trees, all those little stars. Okay? Some of them are like 5 feet apart. Okay, so think about this now. The tree's going to have a canopy that's 75 feet wide, and it's going to have a trunk diameter in 200 years that's about here. Okay, and you have planted it 5 feet away from another Garry oak that's going to have the same kind of canopy. It's not going to work. So as it turns out, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and actually I should go back one slide here. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, so you don't have to believe it just from me, right? Has created a best management practice document. Here's a quote from there. They're basically saying that the loss of fire has caused conifer encroachment to threaten the Oregon white oaks, is what I've been saying. And they're recommending thinning of the conifer trees to keep the a little more lightly understory and also to protect the Garry oaks. And they're saying the same thing about thinning. Some of these Oregon white oak stands become overcrowded with young Oregon white oak. And unless there's fire, those young Oregon white oaks don't get thinned either. Actually, I should say, unless there's deer and elk. You know, one of the things is we're in, the matrix has changed, right? When Warren's ancestors were there, there were elk all the time. The elk came to the tree. The elk herd got thin and taken home for dinner, right? And there was a balance. And those elk would eat the young oaks, some of them, not all of them. And you'd get some regeneration of the oak, but you wouldn't get like hundreds of little oak saplings. The elk would eat most of them, but not all of them, right? We're in a situation here in Seattle where we have neither deer nor elk. And so nothing's going to eat those. We're going to have to do the work ourselves to bring back the relationship that existed in the past. We're going to have to take care of those oaks ourselves. We can't just let nature do it because we've broken nature. Right. We also see situations where we have both. In this case, I think it's on the left. You can see 3 oak trees. Well, you can see the arrows pointing to the 3 oak trees, but you really can't distinguish the 3 oak trees unless you're right there. You can see they're planted right next to 3 conifer trees. Okay, that's also not going to work. In fact, the conifer trees are probably too close together as well. So there's some thinning and stuff that needs to go on. And then here we have a sapling oak that was planted underneath this giant conifer tree. We also have some damage. When we're on our walk, we'll see this. That giant tree, the beautiful tree that we took a picture of, this tree is just to the north of it. It's another giant tree, but as you can see, a branch fell off a long time ago, a major branch. This is about from here to here is a little over 2 feet wide. And normally a tree like this will heal if it's not attacked by termites or disease or something like that. And you can see that the tree is in fact growing bark back. It's recovering. My guess from the distance here is that was about 20 years ago that this tree fell. And it sort of looks like it'll heal, except that if you look at it from a different angle, what you can see here is that when the crew removed the fallen branch, they left this big protrusion sticking out of it. So the tree is not only going to have to cover that distance, but it's going to have to somehow to come up over that, right? In addition, if you look at these spots here, and I know it's very difficult to see in the picture, and look over here where it's a little closer, what you're seeing is a hole in the tree that collects water. So that tree is in trouble because that water is going to cause the rot to occur quickly. Now, I don't think we can, we should do something like cut it and put tar over it or something like that. That's going to make it worse. But we might be able to at least cut this down flat and do something to prevent the water from getting into the tree. I had a similar problem at Martha Washington Park where there was a hole at the bottom that was collecting water, and I just put a plastic sheet over it and glued it down at the top on the bark. It's like a shingle. It kept the water out very effectively, and there was still air able to get in there so that wood could stay dry. Didn't have to put anything over it or cover it in any way. Okay, so those are the problems. We've got some great trees, we've got some great situations, we've got a few things that have to be addressed. Now let's look at some examples. Here's a different neighborhood tree than the one that Tim showed you. This one's right up on Upland Road, in walking distance here. I did talk to someone who was working at this house. I was never able to get a hold of the owner, but the person said that the owner gets an arborist out to look at this tree every 5 years at owner's expense. Okay? They prune it to keep the branches from falling. They've actually cabled a little bit. You can actually see one of the cables here that keeps it from falling. Okay? Yeah, they value that tree, and they're willing to put the money in to make it. Keep that alive. And I keep that. I put that in because I'm trying to show that that's something we might want to do with some of the big trees that we have. Granted, it costs money, and I don't think Parks has the money. We may have to raise the money to do it, but it's something that should. Another place I want to talk about, because they have a couple of good examples of what they do that we can also apply here. Pacific Rim Institute on Whidbey Island. This is have to read it. Okay. Their main restoration activity has been the improvement of a reasonably intact prairie system. But there are two things of interest to us relative to oaks. The first is that they partnered with native peoples. Of course, they're not the only project site to do this. In fact, I recently surveyed 8 sites, and of the 8 sites, 7 of them have partnered in some way with indigenous people. But PRI has a very clear statement of it, which bears repeating, I think, and maybe a model that we can follow. PRI has long had the philosophy that the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest are natural resource restoration partners, because they were the stewards of the region for thousands of years. And by sharing their wisdom, they contribute to PRI's work. In return, PRI offers them fields of their sovereign foods, which are becoming scarce. For example, they have an annual canvas day and bake organized by the Coast Salish Youth Coalition that included 11 representatives from 11 tribes last year. That's something we could consider here at Seward, that kind of relationship. In fact, I know that Parks has been talking to the recognized tribes about how they can work together, and I hope we can build on that and include Seward and Oaks. The other, okay, I guess I put that one up. The other spot I want to talk about is Oak Harbor. If you want to see oaks, go to Oak Harbor. Right? I mean, seriously, there's hundreds of it, and there's some fantastic trees. But the thing I want to talk about is what the Oak Harbor Garry Oak Society is doing. Okay? They've done some educational activities. They've done some. Do you have those things? Yes. Okay. Oh yes, we have show and tell. Okay. So these are actually brochures on the Oak Harbor. These all of them.
No, I have another.
There's another staff. Okay, we'll put them up here for later. Okay. But they have brochures that they provide for everybody talking about their oaks. And they also have signage for these oaks and tours for the oaks. And they have, you know, an online tour. So, where are we here? Yeah. So one of the things they've done is they've taken some of these big trees and they put their little signage on, okay? And I could imagine that for Seward, the same kind of thing, right? Except not just the oaks. We've got some magnificent conifer trees. We've got some magnificent sites. We've got a shoreline. We've got all kinds of things that could be marked out when people come to the park. Self-educational tour that they hook up their cell phone and do, right? The other thing that they do is they're part of the Sound Oaks Initiative. And the Sound Oaks Initiative is in the process of mapping the Garry Oaks and the Puget Sound region. So this is a screen capture of the map of Oak Harbor. And if you go to the site, you click on it, you get a page that tells you about that site, what's going on with the site, a little bit of the history of the site, maybe some pictures of the trees, all that kind of stuff. And I did the same kind of a map for the oaks here, and I can see that some of this stuff is cut off at the bottom, unfortunately. But I did the same thing for the oaks in Southeast Seattle. I have a map online of 140 oaks in Southeast Seattle. I've talked to Eric in Parks about putting it on the Parks website, but you know, it could be on the Audubon website too. It might be easier to put it on the Audubon website since there's less paperwork. Okay, and besides that, Parks has enough stuff to do. You know, we could even. One of the things I've tried to do is take a picture of each tree each year. This year, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that. It would be great to have some students or some volunteers or whatever go around and take pictures of the trees, so we keep a record of these trees over their 100, 200-year lifetime. That would be awesome to do that. Anyway, I've talked to these folks about including our map in their map so that Seattle is also represented in what they're doing. What's next? My favorite site is the Garry Oak Ecosystems Recovery Team. This is a site that was a major inspiration for what we did in my life. I would say my inspirations came from a lot of places. They came from seeing the burned areas around where I lived when I grew up and seeing the wildflowers that were there. It came from my grandparents who were great gardeners. and passed down at least some of their traditional knowledge to me. They came from northern Italy and they were orchardists and farmers and everything else. It came from seeing what people were doing at other sites, and it came from the volunteers and people who donated plants to the parks. It came from the scientific work being done in the South Sound, and it came from these folks in terms of what could be done. So the Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team started informally in 1999 as a coalition of government, First Nations, volunteers, and consultants who strove to preserve and protect Garry Oaks at Vancouver Island. As you can see from the dots, there are a lot of Garry Oak sites on Vancouver Island, and these are all in Coast Salish territory. Many Coast Salish tribes have cooperated with this group. They've been part of the Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team from the beginning. The work at many of these sites has been limited to invasive removal, conifer reliefs, or oak reliefs, which means cutting a few conifers so that your oaks can live. But there are also sites that are either remnant oak understory gardens, and you can see, there's oaks all over the place here, but look at the camas, and I'm not sure what the yellow flower is that's there. Over here we have more camas, and over there we've got camas, and we've got shooting stars and lomation. Biscuit root, which is another edible plant that we haven't talked about. But you can see that underneath this canopy of Garry Oak trees, you have a fabulous prairie-like garden that will be producing food all year for you. But the most important part of their work is this. They produced a handbook that anybody can understand about how to take care of Garry Oaks. It was our Bible they did this time. It has information about propagation. It has information about what plants grow under Garry Oaks, when to plant them, when you can expect them to bloom, historical information about Garry Oaks. It's something that anyone with a modicum of gardening experience can use to take care of the Garry Oak and the grounds underneath. They've also produced a massive amount of documentation. Their best management practice book for Garry Oaks is over 100 pages. It describes all the different possible ecotypes that Garry Oaks live in and everything that you could possibly do about Garry Oaks. But that book right there is the one to start with. So anyway, the other thing is, one of the things that all these sites have in common is use, which is another key to keeping your meadows healthy. Okay? Use of the land that you tend completes the circle. Okay? We plant, we tend, we use. The use brings us back to planting and completes the circle. If we plant, tend, and then just leave it alone, we're not fully part of the life of that area. We're not going to understand everything that's going on. Also, use is a necessary disturbance for many species. For example, I mentioned that rice root for the area. If you leave that, we've seen this and also read about it in Nancy Turner's book, which she talks about the harvesting the practices around this plant. If you leave it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually some animal goes, it looks delicious, I'm going to eat it, and then it's gone. But if you harvest it and do it right, you'll find that there's several large offsets or scales. Scales, I guess, is the right word. They're basically like when a bulb divides. You're going to pull those off. You harvest the bulb, the big bulb, you eat it, but you replant those scales. And in the rice root, there are scales that are about, 1/8 of an inch, but after a couple of years, they become 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 inch. Those are the ones you want to plant. The little ones are going to fall off anyway. Every time you harvest a somewhat mature fritillaria, you are planting dozens of them, whether you try to or not. So I wonder, certainly don't know, but I wonder if the reason we're not seeing more of the fritillaria is that nobody's harvesting it. you know, because we are part of that cycle. Human beings are not separate from nature. We are part of nature. Okay? And we're a key keystone species on this planet. We're the ones that have screwed it up. And it's now our duty to figure out how we can become part of it and make it better. But anyway, I digress. So this quote, I want to read it because I think it's just so important. M. Cat Anderson is a professor at University of Washington in California. University of California in Berkeley, sorry, crazy. Finally got it right, okay? She spent the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years going around to the tribes in California and letting the elders educate her on what was going on. And she wrote in her book, several important insights were revealed to me as I talked with elders and accompanied them on plant gathering walks. The first of these was that one gains respect for nature by using it judiciously. By using a plant or an animal, interacting with it where it lives, and tying your well-being to its existence, you can be intimate with it and understand it. The elders challenged the notion I had grown up with, and I grew up with it too, that one should respect nature by leaving it alone, by showing me that we learn respect through the demands put on us by the great responsibility of using a plant or animal. That's a complete switch from the Society of Ecological Restoration statement position 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I think the restoration community is coming to that more and more. Oh yeah, one more thing. Some of the documents that are available, the one on the left from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Garry Ecosystem Recovery Team, and a group down in Oregon. These are the scientists that work mostly with Oregon, the Forestry Department on oak release. And there's just hundreds more documents. If we want to do an evaluation, all the information is there for us. And there's support from people like our own Department of Fish and Wildlife, and support from the wisdom of Native people who have lived with this area for thousands of years. So what should be done? Let me say that even if nothing is done here at the park, we're still going to have oaks for a long time. We're still going to have the opportunity to use some of the sites of oaks. Over the decades, some of the oaks will certainly get shaded out, some will die from other causes, but many of the recently planted oaks especially will live on. And there are a few historic oaks that are well enough placed to last a very long time. So to some extent, we'll be able to use something. But I think we can do better than that. I think we could, perhaps with the help of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, do the evaluation and identify critical habitat and some possibilities for improved maintenance and utilization. Identifying trees that should be thinned and a few conifers that should be removed or snared. We could, and I think this is perhaps the most important thing, gather with those in the community who have an interest in the oaks and the parks in general, and discuss how we can honor the ancestors whose care gave us the oaks. Not to mention honoring these ancient life forms themselves. With improved management and what I'll broadly call education and cultural activity. And by the community, I mean all the stakeholders, from First Peoples, recognized or not, parks, Friends of Seward Park, the stewards who've been working here for years, groups like QTL, which are trying to reconnect people to the land, and even the old park gardeners like me. It's going to take all of us working together to heal the earth. And what better place to do it than under the trees that were cared for by the first residents? So I think we're going to do questions and discussion now. And already said.
How about another round of applause for Kim? In addition to being live streamed, this program is being recorded and you can access it on YouTube. It'll be there for future viewings, as I'm sure I will want to do, because a lot of great information today, and I really want to inculcate that into my brain and my teaching. So We now are going to entertain question and answers. Remember, this is being live streamed, so if you will ask your question with some projection and clarity, and we'll see if our panel here can provide some answers. So question and answer, anyone? Yeah.
Well, I just want to comment on the Garry Oak Garden we tried to establish here. We got the grant from WNPS, Washington Native Plant Society. I contributed about $500, spent hours and hours weeding and went down to South Olympia to collect plants. But the St. John Ward ran us out of town.
So just to clarify then, St. John's wort being a non-native
Yeah.
invasive species that has sort of overgrown that area. And so that's a good comment and relates to, I mentioned that invasive species are a big problem on these historic oak savannas and oak woodlands. And I'll just actually say, so I was using savannas and woodland interchangeably, and I want to clarify.
We all do.
Yeah. So we think that the ecosystems here around Seward Park were more like woodlands than savannas, but we know that there are places, for example, down on Muckleshoot, where you have these wider meadows, and it's more savanna-like, but it's a continuum, like David said. But no, that's great, and I think one thing we've noticed is parks recently did, you guys came in with some mowers, right? And I think they mowed down some of that St. John's wort that you're talking about. So that might be a first step in rejuvenating the camas that you put in there. So yeah,
Just a comment, the Navy has a site in Oak Harbor. And that site is, I don't know, 40 acres, a couple hundred acres. They started mowing down the snowberry, and the snowberry was 8 feet high. They didn't think anything was under it. Well, as they mowed the snowberry, they're getting fawn bullets. At Martha, Washington, we have a spot that was completely covered with snowberry. And all we've done is cut the snowberry to the ground every year, and the camas grows. I don't know if that'll work with St. John's Park. No way I can know that. But it might be an interesting thing to try. See if that's good.
Al, was the site free of St. John's wort when you started that work, or?
Well, when we started the work, it was just covered with St. John's wort. I probably spent 100 or more hours weeding, pulling that stuff up, and you get to the point where you think, well, maybe I weeded it all up, but boy, if you turn your back on it, it was just right there. So the camas and the other things we planted, there might be something still left of it, but I even doubt that. I think there was camas a couple of years ago.
I saw one camas flower come up this year. So,
Okay,
yeah.
there you go.
But yeah, so it's a good point though, that this requires sustained effort. It's not just like you do it once and then you walk away.
And there may be some weeds that are just impossible. I know that prairie in Covington, the one on 240th Street. The camas was doing very well there with only mowing at the end of summer. But there was a spot where some quackgrass had grown, and the quackgrass was spreading, and nothing was coming up to the quackgrass, even though it was being mowed. So there are some weeds, and maybe the St. John's wort is one of them, that you're just not going to make it no matter what you do. Very possible.
Hand in the back, go ahead.
I read that, don't discard the acorn, even if there's a hole in it, because it could be just one larva and it may survive. So it's worth a try. Did you know anything about that?
Well, I'll let you answer it, but I'll just, Joey, should we be repeating the questions for the camera here?
We got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay, go ahead.
It comes down to how many acorns do you need and how many do you have? Okay, you're obviously going to be better off with an acorn that isn't eaten than an acorn that is eaten, right? But the ones that are eaten partially will grow. We've seen that happen. The standard test for acorns is the float test. You put them in water. If they float, you discard them in general. And now, if you only have a few acorns, then try anything, right? last year we had a mast year and we had acorns coming out of our ears. So, yeah, we only took the really good ones. You know, so, but, if you only have a few, then, yeah, they might grow even though there's a worm in them. Seen that.
So, sorry, I saw your hand first.
I have a question for Warren. Thank you for the history. It was so fascinating. And this may be an impossible question, but is there anything in the history of the source, whether this was through trade, that these were brought here? Or is this just a natural occurrence in history at some other geological time when it was a different climate?
Yeah, that's a.
Is that an impossible question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you could actually, theorize a number of explanations why certain plants grow in certain locations, but habitat is defined by specific plants, right?
Right.
And so, and if you, I guess if you, amplify those the natural resources or the natural setting, and you do that through these little management tricks that the ancestors utilized, you know, these things are going to come back. So if as one example, if the bank of a pond or a lake has been, I guess, mismanaged, and someone goes in and clears that pond, that habitat around the water line there, and the Wapato suddenly reappear. And I think that's another example of what happens when you work with Mother Nature. So I can't stress that enough. And I think that those plants are there, and they were there prior to. So what was it, 15,000 years ago, when the ice age, when the glacier began to recede, right? So I think that you know, Mother Nature had a plan then, and like I mentioned before, there's a template that Mother Nature utilizes, and when you work with that template, good things do happen.
I was thinking of the climate on the east side, back into Idaho and the trade that went across, and I just wondered if maybe that was something that was originally a cherished item, but I understand it's history that may not have been.
Yeah.
Well, then, so so if you look at Stella Leopold's research, for example, she passed away recently, but she did a lot of work looking at pollen cores from bogs in this area. And you can go back 10,000 years after the last ice age and see that there was Garry oak here. And in fact, the savannas were much more widespread after the glaciers, right after the glaciers retreated. So we've been seeing a contraction of this habitat as the conifers moved back into the area after glaciation. But there's been contraction and expansion depending on how climate has fluctuated over the past 10,000, 12,000 years or so. But I think now we're at the end of a contraction period, because like I said, the Garry oak distribution, Garry oak savanna distribution is spotty across this area that was probably had once much more expansive.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
It was all very.
Go ahead.
Is there any pressure from an economic point of view to harvest Garry oak or the wood, for things like floors, furniture, whiskey barrels?
Do you know?
The only thing I can tell you is the view of an experienced woodworker, Bob Nelson, who said that it was not very good wood for construction because it was so angular and not straight. So, we suspect, it's conjecture that a lot of the Garry oaks were cut down for firewood. But that's just a guess. It's really just a guess. Slow, long. Yeah.
We did a salvage one time of oak. There were it was oak that was used just as a decoration. And I suspect they're not native oak, but when these young oak were harvested and removed, I asked for a couple of the slabs of the main trunk. And it was a very dense wood, very heavy, and difficult to lift. It actually required heavy equipment to move some of the larger trunks. And so I would imagine that if there is a market for it, you have to invest into some pretty heavy equipment beforehand. Because it wasn't like cedar or like fir, yeah, this was it was very heavy and dense wood to work with when it was green.
Yeah, when you watch it grow, maybe we even get to see some of this, when you see a branch that comes out like this, and then at the tip of it, there'll be, 10 buds, okay? And they'll go in all different directions. And so what you see for the Garry oak is, sticks that are going crooked, right? So it's not particularly useful for lumber, but it could be useful for carving. It could be useful for a lot of things. Bob Nelson thought it was a great wood to carve like a bowl of something. Go ahead, sorry.
Innate wildlife is my forte, not plants. As far as the thinning goes, is the wilt a problem? Where it will impact the other oaks in the area? Am I a crazy person?
Sorry, the what? The wilt?
Oak wilt, is that an issue? It doesn't sound like it's.
I'm not sure what you mean by oak wilt.
Where when you cut down one, and you cut down one, oak, then the other oaks.
Oh, the roots doing, affecting the other roots. That's a darn good question, and I think it's something we ought to get an expert opinion on before we start cutting down things to end. One that had not occurred to me. That's why we're having a discussion. A good point.
I have another question that's almost either you really know it or you really won't. Dendrochronology, do we have an established one for the oaks?
Dendrochronology, so like the study of tree rings, the growth rates, is that you're thinking about?
I think it would be really interesting for some of these oaks. The estimate that I've used for the age is so crude. There's an oak that fell at Martha Washington, and I counted 135 rings. And that ring was maybe 5 feet above the ground, so I added 5 years and said it's 140 years. Okay. And then I extrapolated from how fast that tree grew to estimate the age of the trees. That's hopelessly inaccurate, but it's the best that I could do.
So another hand back here. Go ahead.
This would also be a question for Warren, and it was very fascinating to learn more about the cultural history of the land that we are all now living on. And I understand from what you were saying that, of course, a lot of the maintenance of the oak areas was to provide food sources, the animals that came to them and the plants that grew under them. And then the question I have is, to what extent, if at all, were the acorns themselves valued as a food source, and are they being used anymore?
They were used as a part of the staple food, but our ancestors also understood that they can be toxic, and so they devised a trick to leach out the toxins. And actually, there was one dish that my elders, my teachers talked about, and that was, it had something to do with the eggs of, say, a Chinook salmon, or a coho salmon, because they're in the river systems, roughly around the time the acorn is ready for harvest. And so there was a meal that was created by this leaching process, and then added to fresh salmon eggs were added to it and baked. to create a meal. Yeah, so it was actually part of the seasonal diet, pre-contact. Yeah.
Are there any questions from online?
Yes. Okay, we have a question. We've been working for months to save a roughly 400-year-old Garry oak in Tumwater. It is healthy and full canopied and been judged so by professionals, but city would cut it down. Can you suggest entities to help?
And it's known as the Davis meeker oak. I don't know if you up here have heard of the controversy.
I'm guessing from the silence that we don't have an immediate answer to that, but I would sure like to know how to contact that person and put him or her in contact with some people who might be able to.
So the make sure we get that contact. Then the city owns it.
Cities make up reasons for.
Well, a number of years ago, probably maybe 20 years ago, there was a Garry oak was cut down in the neighborhood and went up county. It was fast and furious because it was on private property. It was about 100 years. I don't imagine anyone would get away with doing something like that now. It was on Arthur Lee Jacobson's heritage list. So you have one of his books, so it was, yeah.
Yeah, I actually, on the map that I've done, there are some folks that are now missing.
Oh,
I saw a few years ago, they're not there anymore. Oh, by the way, if you do want to see this map, you just go to davidparasso.us, and there's a link. But you can't use it until tomorrow because I changed the map to do only the historical, so he can have a slide. I haven't restored the rest of the old state map. Okay, I should have done it before. davidparasso.us, you'll see that. You know, one of the black squares will be one of the ones that you mentioned. Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to think a little bit more about the option for fire. We have some examples from other cities, Portland being one, and then also St. Louis is also doing burning in their forested areas in very urban areas. And so just wondering, especially for Warren, if there are families that are still holding that knowledge, if there's any priority from Muckleshoot for that type of practice, and then also just, yeah, to think together about what it would mean to do burning here in Seward.
That's actually a very good question. Yes, the Muckleshoot tribe is working with certain agencies like the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, also the Cedar River watershed. Fire has many benefits, like you've heard and learned through this presentation. But it also creates hazards and is actually considered a liability, right, if it's not done correctly. And so we've been dealing with the conversations that have been actually pushed away or pushed aside and ignored. But one potential solution is that, you know, if we can't use the fire, then shouldn't we be able to use the results of fire? Like say, burn a log and then bring that log to the site and let those nutrients leach back into the soil, into the water system, or into that habitat. So we proposed that with Forest Service, dealing with huckleberry management, Vaccinium membranaceum, the big huckleberry. That was one of our major management tools for huckleberry fields. And so we've been kind of wrestling with the idea of burning logs off-site and then delivering them to the berry field. But prepping them, so prepping the field, so getting rid of some of the conifers and thinning some of the conifers, and then bringing in 2 or 3 or 4 logs that have been burned off-site and let them do their magic, let them do their work. And so we're actually doing, we proposed that on a site in Delridge, working with the city of Seattle, on a capstone project with the University of Washington students. And so hopefully this year we'll burn our first couple of logs, and then in the springtime we'll deliver those logs to the Delridge site to see how that works in that area.
Where is
What kind
the
of
dark
logs?
side?
What kind of logs? Any kind of logs?
We don't know. We're gonna try any kind. We'll probably go with fir at first, maybe a hemlock. Okay.
Whereabouts in Delridge?
It's the city of Seattle's property. It's
Sylvan,
what is it?
Sylvan and Delridge.
I can't remember the
Yeah,
name of it.
by Home Depot.
Yeah, that's it. It is by Home Depot. Yeah. So, and that's what we're gonna do it. So the UW students are gonna help us clean out some of the invasives and then make some room for, do some outplant, some burnt log outplant. Experiment with it.
The biochar folks are kind of doing the same thing too. And one of the things about that regular fire, it's a fairly low temperature fire. I remember as a kid, they would tell us to stay away from the fire, and so what we would do is we would go and jump over the flames, you know. No sense of anything. But it was a low temperature fire. My father was a city worker, and he went up with a shovel. That was his control tool, right? Because they burned it every year, so it was never a hot fire. Well, the biochar folks try to do a cool fire that those terms can match, right? So that you're not converting that organic matter to, you know, potassium oxide, right? You're breaking down the organic matter in there. A lot of it becomes charcoal, but some of it is sort of semi-broken down and you make it bad in the soil. And that's another possibility, you know, and I think this idea of burning logs and bringing it, that's fabulous. I mean, I never heard of that. I think it's just fantastic.
Another technique I've been seeing in more agriculture is just going around with a blowtorch, torching certain things in specific places, such as not like a conflagration, but you're still retaining the heat and presumably the nutrients are staying.
Yes, and I've actually done that, okay, and the best time to do it, as Warren said, is when it's rained a bit. Okay, because then you're steaming the plants as well as burning them, and you get that biochar. Okay, if you do it too early, it flames, and all you have is not very nutritious ash. Gritty ash, right, gray ash, yeah. So, yeah, I've done that. And, it's a lot safer when it's rained.
It's
The other
char,
thing I've heard-
CHAR.
What?
I'm sorry, it's char, CHAR, but biochar.
Well, the biochar, I'm not an expert on biochar.
Can you spell it this way?
What?
Can you spell it?
That's.
BIOCHAR.
Okay, thank you, sorry.
Right, but it is a lower temperature burning that doesn't completely ash the material. That's the key. The other thing that I've seen about burning is, and that someone told me about, was that you basically you create a square of metal that has a hole in it, and you put that where you know, around what you want to burn, and then you burn that. When that's out, you move the square and burn again. Okay, that would be a fairly useful thing, like in a yard or a very small garden. We work for acres and acres of prairie, of course, but we should be able to do this. I mean, I think Ed was pointing out to me that the fire department comes up there and practices every day. Well, think of practice. If the fire department in the 1960s in Richmond, California could burn next to oil tanks, which is what they did, we ought to be able to do something.
Ed and I took a soil core of in the Garry Oak area for a carbon research project, and there is a layer of charcoal down there. So it is interesting.
Well, it's a beautiful day. Let's say we go outside and take a little tour of the oaks that are just around the corner and the one that the sun, October on the south slope.
One thing before you go, okay, one thing before you go. I'm hoping, and I think some other people are hoping here, is that we could have a discussion. We can have a continuing discussion about the oaks in Seward Park, and for that matter, Mark Whiting Park, maybe the neighborhood. And if people are interested in that, I'm not sure how they can put their name down or whatever to hear more about it.
I will put a note in there for how to reach you, because we will email everyone who registered for the program. We'll email everyone with a link to the online presentation and a link to get connected with you.
Excellent. Okay, that'll work. Oh, buddy, like.